last week is we are on page, top of page 10. So we're still pretty early in the book. We read the doctor's opinion. And then again, anybody new that has not read that, man, study that. We normally, if we're mentoring people, we usually ask you to read that 30 days in a row. If you miss a day, start over. Sounds elementary. It's like, come on. But the information in there, I just kind of gave you the highlights of what an addict is. All the information in specific detail is in that 7¼ pages of the doctor's opinion. It's a great thing to read, study, and have a mentor go over it with you. Because if you don't know, the first step is to concede the directions. Notice there's no directions up here. These are cliff notes. There's no directions on how to do any of this. The directions are on page 30 for step 1. It says we have to fully concede to our innermost selves we're alcoholic. So if you're going to fully concede to your innermost selves that you're an addict or an alcoholic, does that not lend you to believe that you better know what an alcoholic is if you're going to concede to it? That means not my opinion of what it is or what you think it might be, but what does the book say it is? That's where you learn exactly what it is. So they give you the information in the first 3 chapters in the doctor's opinion to determine if you are one of us or not, whether you are an addict or not. So with that, we got through that. So we learned what we're dealing with, basically down to those 2 questions. You ever tried quitting, found you couldn't? Or have you ever started drinking and had little control over the amount you take? Only 2 questions that matter. They follow that up with chapter 1, which is Bill's story, which is what we're in right now. This is, I believe, our 3rd week in Bill's story, and we're on page 10. And what they're giving us right now is a case study that's built upon those 2 principles of what an addict and an alcoholic is. What is it? Can't stop, can't control the amount I take. And they show us exactly what happened to Bill. And that's all that mattered with Bill. A lot of people believe, well, these people who wrote this, they were, old, down. I mean, these were low bottom guys. That's what I hear all the time. Not too many of them know that Bill started this whole deal when he was 35. He was done drinking. I don't think that's really old and washed out, right? It's not. I mean, I got in when I was 14, belonged here then, didn't know it, had everybody around me saying, but man, I remember one guy said, if I drank, or if you could not have drank as much as I spilled during my drinking. So how can you be an alcoholic? So, well, you're a sloppy drunk. You spill. I didn't spill very much. But at the end of the day, they didn't know what it meant to be an alcoholic. He's indicating that you got to be a certain age. You had to have drank for so long to become one. He had no idea what he's talking about. And you'll find that a lot of things, when you start studying this and then go to meetings, I don't care how long somebody's sober, listen to them and see how much of it may contradict what you hear in here. Because this is the program of recovery in this book. And if somebody is saying things that contradict it, I would say ignore it, because they told us all we need is what's in this book. If we do what they did, we'll get what they got, period. Okay. Now, old Jimbo might have something. He's been sober 20 years. Okay. If you want to take your chance on Jimbo's 1-person experience, by all means, go for it. See where he leads you to. Might work for you. We're not going to say it's now. We don't know what the hell you're going to get. But what we do know is if you precisely follow this, it'll be rare for you to fail. So we find it much safer to just follow this because it's rare. So now we're being at the where we're at in Bill's story. We went through in the beginning, watching the progression of his alcoholism. And then we got to the top of page 9 when things started to change. And that's when his old drinking buddy, Ebby, come along. And he was sober. And Bill said that he was amazed. I haven't seen that guy sober. I don't know if I've ever seen that guy sober. He was much worse than me. And at this point, Bill's already been at the hospital. They already pronounced him incurable. You're going to die of this condition. He was hopeless and he knew it. But what happened is that down near the bottom of page 9, Ebby said that he was getting ready to be committed to a hospital for alcoholic insanity. That's what they did back then. They didn't put us in treatment centers. They didn't have them. You're going to be committed for alcoholic insanity. And then 2 guys stepped up for him and said to the judge, put him in our care. We've got some experience with alcoholics just like him, and we're a couple of them. This is before AA was ever formed. Said we got a simple religious idea, it says, and a practical program of action that has worked for us. Let us try it with him before you lock him up. And he let him go. And he let him under their care. And it says at the bottom of that page 9, he says that was 2 months ago. And the result was self-evident. It worked. He'd never been sober 2 months. He was sober 2 months. But get this, sober 2 months. And what is Ebby doing in his program of action at 2 months? The last sentence says he had come to pass the experience along to me. He's already looking for someone to help at 2 months. Sound like it's important? He had an impress on him how important it was. So he came to Bill. Top page 10, where we left off, says he came to pass along to me if I cared to have it. Do you want what I have? Now, he went to the hospital 3 times because he was in terrible shape. He was dying. In the hospital, this chief physician told him, you're done. Guys like you, there's nothing, we've tried everything. There's nothing we can do for you. You're going to die like this. That's what the doctor told him, right? Gotta be sober. If you care to have it, I'll show you what I did. That's what we do here. If you care to have it, I'm not telling you what you got to do. If you want to find another way, by all means, knock yourself out. Our hats are off to you. If you can find another way, great. But if you can't, and this is the last house on the block, you might want to give this a shot. So he said, if I cared to have it, and Bill said I was shocked. Bill didn't want anything to do with this religious idea, but he says he was interested. And he said, certainly I was interested. Why? He says, I had to be. That had sounds like a must. I had to be interested. Why? He says, because I was hopeless. That's what the doctor told him. Hopeless by definition in the dictionary, which is the only other book that we use to make sure we understand the words that we're using. Hopeless is defined as no possibility of a solution. None. He knew there was no possibility of a solution. Yet he's looking at this guy who was worse off than him, and he must have found something. Right? So I believe that's where we left off, right? Top of that page. So let's go on and see what happened with old Bill here. It says, Ebby, he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge that I never signed, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died, these recollections welled up from the past, and they made me swallow hard. That's all that Bill knew about religion, is that of like just a young boy from what he heard from his grandfather. His grandfather said, yeah, what they say, there's truth in it. And it is the way but nobody's going to tell me how to live. He wanted nothing to do with the organized religion. And that's what Bill had instilled in him. He wanted anything to do with the organized religion. He says that wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back again. We read about that, I think in the first week. And Bill's going to start thinking about this idea of God, because that's all. What did Debbie say he had? A religious program and a practical program of action. Program of action means I'm going to have to do something, but it also has something to do with religion. He did not like the religion, but he's hopeless. So he's going to be fighting back and forth with one thing, which every newcomer has to come to terms with. You might have been able to answer yes to either one of those 2 questions in the beginning. So you might know that you're an alcoholic, step 1. Okay. You might even have a sense of the second part they talk about here, that your life's unmanageable. But the question at this point is, how bad do you want to get well? Are you willing to do anything? Because there's many people who know that they belong in that category, but I just don't want it bad enough that I'm willing to change my life, because it's more than just actually has very little to do with going to meetings. But at this point, that's what Bill's confronted with. How bad do I want it? So he's starting to think about God, and he says, I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces were at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlie all. How could there be such precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe who neither knew time nor limitation. But that was as far as I gone. That's it. With ministers and the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who is love, superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated, and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. Anybody experience that? This is not common with all of us. But it does talk about later that nearly half of the original membership, they were agnostic. That's what this is. Actually, agnostics believe that there's some kind of a God. Nothing to do with religion, but there's got to be something there, but they have no experience with it. They don't know what it, but it makes sense. And, if that's not where you are, keep in mind that the whole deal here, after you become recovered, that's not an end all. To stay that way, because I said we're not cured. To stay that way, we have to pass this message along. And if you're not one of these people, please pay close attention to this, because there's a 50-50 chance that somebody that you work with is going to be of this type. And you're going to need to know how to deal with them and how to deal with that situation and explain this to them. So that's as far as he'd gone. His mind snapped shut and he was irritated. He said, to Christ, now he's talking about specific religion, to Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man who was not too closely followed by those who claimed him. His moral teaching, most excellent. For myself, I've adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult, and the rest I disregarded. The wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery that religious dispute had facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I'd seen in Europe, back when he was in World War I, and since the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The brotherhood of man, a jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me. That's where Bill's whole conception of God is, right? It's very mixed. However, but my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Isn't that what happened every time you guys tried quitting and ended up going back? When you quit, what are you using? Your willpower. I'm done. It failed. But now this guy's sober. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. And like myself, he'd admitted complete defeat. But then he had, in fact, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. They say anything about Ebby being sober? He's living a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this a power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There'd been no more power in him than there was in me at that moment, and that was none at all. And that floored me. I began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in the human heart which had done the impossible. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Why did they become revised? He opened up his mind a little bit, didn't he? How could they not be revised? He's sitting right in front of a guy who he knows very well, and yet he looks at him and doesn't even recognize him. His life is completely turned around, and he knows he didn't do it on his own. Doesn't know how it happened. Asked him how it happened. God. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped a new soil. Despite the living example of my friend, there remain in me the vestiges of my old prejudices. I would underline that statement. Got the living example of my friend in front of me. I still have the vestiges of my old, he uses the word prejudice against religion. So I looked up the word prejudice one time, thought I knew what it meant, but it means to have an adverse opinion or a leaning that was formed without just grounds or before having sufficient knowledge. Oh, I don't want to hear about that. I already know. Closing our mind off. Now get this. I want you to understand the fatality of that word prejudice. I want you to go to page 48 and give you a little bit of preview of coming attractions here. Now we learned, at least we already mentioned in the beginning, that it's rare for you to fail if you thoroughly follow our path. We know that they're going to give us clear-cut directions on how they recover. So it'd be rare for you to fail. Well, this is one thing that they say will be a block. This is one of the only things I see in this book that says, this is what can stop you. It's at the top of page 48. And he says, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. I found ourselves handicapped. Obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Where does that stuff come from? This is what's going to mentally disable us. We call them the OSUFs, obstinacy, sensitiveness, unreasoning. I don't want nothing to do with that. Well, the question is, are you hurting bad enough that you're willing to listen? Because if you close your mind off, you're going to remain handicapped. There's nothing we can do for you at that point. Are you hurting bad enough to listen to a solution that you might not like? Because you have a leaning with this prejudice without just grounds, without sufficient knowledge. Are you open-minded to at least get the knowledge so that then you can weigh what you think versus what this person's saying and make a fair judgment? But if you're not even willing, you certainly aren't going to do the rest of this work, right? Just not there yet. And the only thing that brings us to that point is enough pain. Go out there and try some more controlled drinking over and over and over and over again until it either kills you or you might come back being, how do they put it in the book? Being beat into reasonableness, right? We can't do that. You have to do that yourself. That's part of step one that you have to do by going out there drinking. We can't do that for you. You're either open-minded or you're not. You're either hurting bad enough or not. So that's where Bill is. So understand when he said he's got these prejudices, that's his block. That's what's going to stop him from getting this. He says the word God still arouses a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway may be. So look at his ego and his sarcasm, right? I've since talked to scores of men who felt the same way. And then Ebby ended this conversation. He ended the whole thing. And this is where religion left AA before it was even started. Ebby looked at him and he said, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. And he said, and this is all in italics, why don't you choose your own conception of God? You don't need mine. You don't need the Christ. You don't need the religion. How about you just choose your own conception? Now, Bill had all this block going on, wants nothing to do with it. But when somebody says to you, if you got a block with something because you don't want anything to do with it, and they say, well, why don't you get your own conception? If any one of you had ever had a problem with your own conception of anything, there's nothing to fight at if I can have my own conception. Didn't know you could do that. Have my own conception? Says that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I'd lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. I would underline this because this is part of step 2 for Bill. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required for me to make my beginning. Notice in step 2, it says came to believe. It doesn't mean that you have to believe. The directions are just be willing to. And how do you become willing to believe? Okay, well, are you open-minded to do what I did? Are you hurting bad enough to try it? Even if you don't believe it'll work. You don't have any other options. What do you got to lose? Are you willing to try it? Just being willing is willing to believe. I'm willing to believe that this being restored to sanity will happen because it happened to you. Let me try it and see if it happens. You're not going to believe until something happens. How are you going to believe just based on this guy's experience? I got a curiosity. I think it might, but are you hurting bad enough to try it? Or are you just going to be absent? If you're willing to try to do the work, that's all that's required. Do not let anybody tell you anything more is required. You do not have to believe. You do not have to have faith in anything. Just are you willing? Okay. And he said, just from that, I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Thus, I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. So when is God concerned with us? When we want him enough. We'll find later who does the seeking. We've lost this connection with God. Does God seek us or do we seek him? We do the seeking. We want him bad enough, we do the seeking. When we want him bad enough. At long last, I felt, I believed, in scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. There went his prejudice, there went his block. A new world came into view. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. I would underline for a brief moment, I needed and wanted God. It's for a brief moment. This happens with many of us. There had been a humbling willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by the worldly clamors, mostly within myself. That's what happens to us all the time. Worldly clamors of the day block out the direction we're trying to get here. And so it had been ever since, and how blind I'd been. At the hospital, now this is Bill's third trip to the hospital. Remember, in the doctor's opinion, it was in the third trip that he got well. So he went back to the hospital. And I would look at that hospital, that they were there for what? The hospital specialized in one thing, addiction. So it didn't say they showed how to get over it. Remember, the chief guy said, oh, you guys, you're screwed. There's nothing we can do for you. But there is one point of that hospital, and it's what happens here. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. That's what they do there. That's generally what they do in treatment centers. They will separate you for a period of time from that in which you're addicted to. But what happens when you get back in the real world and it's all around you and you start feeling restless, irritable, and discontent? You're going to get it, right? That's their whole point, is to separate you from it. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. There, I humbly offered myself to God, as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. This is Bill now. We already saw, as soon as he said he found out that it was only a matter to be willing to do the work, he was done with step 2. What we're seeing here now is step 3. When he's in the hospital, he humbly offered himself to God, and he said, you do with me as what I will. We're going to read a whole lot on that later. But this idea of step 3, turning our will in our lives, our will is our thoughts, and our lives is accumulation of our actions. So what we're really doing is turning our thoughts and our actions over to him. What that has, and it really has little to nothing to do with the alcohol or the drugs. It has to do with my running life on my own will. It's even my designs for a better life. Like, I'm going to go back to college and I'm going to do this and I do that. You know what, this deal? That's not what this is about. What would you have me be and what would you have me do? Are you willing to bite that down? And whatever it is, grow towards it, despite what I want for me. Because me trying to get what I want for me is what leads me to being restless, irritable, and discontent to begin with, and then needing that sense from something else. That's the connection we got to make. It's from self-will. It's not from just drinking a lot. And that's why none of these steps here say anything about alcohol, drinking. Doesn't even say stop drinking anywhere in there. Wouldn't you think that'd be somewhere in that directions? Not. But think about it again. If you feel better when you're sober, you're not going to be thinking about the sense of ease and comfort, right? We don't need to tell you to stop. You're not going to want to have it. It goes back to, it's not why can't I stop? It's why do I start again? Right? That's what we're getting down to here. So where are we at here? I'd wanted God, there'd been that humbling willingness to have him, and it was blotted out by these worldly clamors. At the hospital, he separated. He did step 3, where he offered himself to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Care and direction. Who's going to direct his life? Direct his life? That's God. That's the decision that he made. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. And what that means in practical terms is my life is unmanageable. And I am now convinced that as long as I keep trying to manage it, it's going to stay that way. Nothing to do with drinking. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend, capital F, take them away, root and branch. I've not had a drink since. So he ruthlessly faced his sins is what he calls it. That's going to be the beginnings of step 4. And he's willing to have God remove, that's step 6, and gets into step 7, take it away, root and branch. And he hasn't had a drink since. So that's doing 4 through 8. My schoolmate, now this is Ebby. Ebby comes to him while he's in the hospital. This is where Bill got the solution, not from the hospital. It was from Ebby coming back to him after that conversation, saying, you done now? You done? Let's show you what we need to do. And Bill did it. And he says, I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. That's step 5. We made a list of people I'd hurt and towards whom I felt resentment. Well, that happens in step 4, becomes step 8. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals admitting my wrong. Step 9. Never was I to be critical of them, and I was to right all such matters to the utmost of my ability. He's doing these things again. How does that connect with stopping drinking? The hell does that got to do with drinking? My sins. Going back and making amends to people in my past. What the hell's that got to do with drinking? We'll find out later. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness. This is step 10 and 11. This is after we're recovered. Midway through step 9, we find that's when we it tells us in the book, by the time you are halfway through making your amends, you will have recovered. If you have not recovered by midway through step 9, you must have missed something. You must not have been doing something right. You must not have thoroughly followed the path, unless you're one of those rare cases, right? Something must be wrong. But by that time, you will have recovered. Now, to stay recovered, now we live the AA way of life, which begins with testing my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. And I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. So all my problems, in the doctor's opinion, what do they say happen after the end of the cycle, right at the end of it? So we go into drinking, we have this, at the end of it, it says our problems pile up on us and become astonishingly difficult to solve. And I'd ask the new people here, are you here because you really want to stop drinking? Or are you here because your problems have piled up on you and become astonishingly difficult to solve? Because it's always the better part of two. It's always that. But here, he's saying that he would sit in doubt and ask for direction and strength to meet all his problems. That means I'm not handling my problems anymore. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore to the usefulness of others. Then and only then might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. I would underline this. My friend promised, and that's a lowercase f, so that's Ebby. Ebby promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, and that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered his drinking problem. Oh, it doesn't say that. It says answered all my problems. Elements of a way of living to answer all of my problems. Belief in a God, the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things, those were the requirements. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. And it's not giving up drinking. The price to be paid is the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn all things into the Father of light who presided over us.